Hello, my name is Marieke Meur. I'm an assistant professor at Western University, and I'm giving the first outro lecture of the Deep Learning Day, which builds on today's second tutorial. The aim of this lecture is twofold. First, I'll provide a high-level overview of deep convolutional neural networks and how to compare them to the brain, summarizing key points of the tutorial. Second, I will discuss how to improve neural networks as models of the brain. As you've seen today, deep convolutional neural networks are currently the best computational models of primate vision. Object recognition is implemented by the primate ventral visual system, a hierarchical system of brain regions located in the occipital and temporal lobes. Visual information that hits the retina travels through the LGN to V1, the first cortical station of visual information processing. Information then gets transformed further as it travels up the hierarchy through V2, V4, and inferior temporal cortex or IT. Neurons in V1 preferentially respond to lower level visual features, such as oriented edges. As we move up the hierarchy, the complexity of preferred features increases from oriented edges to textures, object parts, entire objects, and object categories such as faces and places. Deep convolutional neural networks are loosely inspired by the ventral visual system. They're hierarchical systems consisting of multiple layers, like brain regions, each consisting of units, like neurons, which are connected by weights that can be adjusted through learning, like synapses. This image shows AlexNet, the first convolutional neural network that scaled up to the real-life task of object recognition in natural images. When AlexNet came out in 2012, it outperformed other computer vision models on the ImageNet Object Recognition Challenge by a large margin. Subsequent years have seen further improvements in performance, and DeepNets now surpass human performance on ImageNet. In summary, deep convolutional neural networks outperform other computational models at object recognition. Furthermore, they also explain brain activity and behavior relatively well, even though they were not explicitly trained to do so. So these findings suggest that networks that are better at object recognition are also better at explaining brain and behavior. Is this indeed the case? Well, this plot here shows ImageNet performance on the x-axis and performance at explaining brain activity and behavior during object perception on the y-axis, summarized in one value, the brain score. Brain scores are based on neural recordings from non-human primates and behavioral data from humans. Each dot in the plot refers to a model. Gray dots are base nets, which are small AlexNet-like architectures captured at various stages of training. Green dots are commonly used deep neural network families, including AlexNet, VGG, and ResNet. As expected, overall, there is a strong positive correlation between ImageNet performance and brain score. However, recent models, shown in the top right corner, only show a weak correlation between ImageNet performance and performance at predicting brain data and behavior. This suggests that we have arrived at a point in model development where improving object categorization performance may not suffice anymore as a proxy for improving a model's ability to explain brain information processing. We will come back to this point later, but let's first review how to assess a network's ability to explain brain activity and behavior. To assess this, we need to characterize the relationships between neural networks, brain activity, and behavior. We can do so by using the concept of representational similarity. I'll explain this using an example. So in a series of studies, we use the following real-world object images. The objects are from a range of categories, including humans, animals, faces, bodies, and natural and man-made objects. We asked human participants to view these images while we measured their brain activity with functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. We then characterized the brain responses to these images as follows. For each image, we computed the response pattern elicited by that image across a region of interest, in this case IT. For each pair of images, we then estimated the dissimilarity between their response patterns, for example by computing 1 minus the correlation across space. We then stored the dissimilarity estimate in a matrix. The axes of the matrix are spanned by the object stimuli, such that each entry reflects the dissimilarity between two stimuli. Dissimilarities are color-coded. Blue means that two images elicited similar response patterns. Red or yellow indicates that two images elicited different response patterns. The matrix is symmetric about a diagonal of zeros. The diagonal entries are zero because they reflect the dissimilarity of a response pattern to itself. Now I'm going to show you the fMRI data from IT. We can immediately see two results that jump out. First, a tight cluster of human faces. This is the blue square in the left corner, which indicates that human faces elicited very similar response patterns. And second, a category division between animate and inanimate objects. Whenever a pair of objects consists of an animate and inanimate object, we see high dissimilarities as indicated by red and yellow colors. The matrix shows which stimulus information is emphasized and which information is de-emphasized by a particular brain region, and thus characterizes how the region represents the stimuli. We refer to this matrix as a representational dissimilarity matrix, or RDM. We can visualize the information in an RDM in an intuitive way by using multidimensional scaling, or MDS, which reduces the dimensionality of the data while preserving the high-dimensional dissimilarities as best as possible. In the reduced 2D space, distances between images reflect dissimilarities. Images that are placed close together elicited similar response patterns. Images that are placed further apart elicited dissimilar response patterns. We can color code the images to better bring out the structure in the data. This clearly shows the animate-inanimate division and the tight cluster of human faces that we also saw in the RDM. The great thing about this approach, which we refer to as representational similarity analysis, is that we can compute RDMs not only for brain activity, but also for behavior, I'll show this in a minute, and importantly, for activity in a neural network. In the latter case, the response patterns are activity patterns across units in a particular layer of the neural network in response to images. We can correlate RDMs to characterize the relationships between neural networks, brains, and behavior. If we have multiple models, we can test which one best explains the brain data and behavior. This is important because it allows us to test competing hypotheses about the neural computations that give rise to the measured representations. Let's apply representational similarity analysis to our example of real-world object images. We already saw the human IT representation of these objects, plotted here with slightly different color coding for the MDS plot. In addition to the brain data, we also acquired similarity judgments for these objects shown here. Objects that are placed close together were perceived as similar. Objects that are placed further apart were perceived as different. The two representations, brain and behavior, have multiple features in common. For example, both show a tight cluster of human faces and a category division between animates and inanimates. Consistent with this observation, the Spearman correlation coefficient between the brain and behavioral RDMs is 0.39, which is significantly different from 0. These results suggest that objects that elicit similar response patterns in IT are also perceived as similar. The big question now is whether these data can be explained by a deep convolutional neural network. To address this question, we presented the object images to AlexNet and computed the object representation in fully connected layer 7, which is at a level in the hierarchy comparable to IT. The object representation in FC7, shown here, indeed appears similar to both the object representation in IT and the judgments. This observation is confirmed by the significant correlations between the model and the data. The correlation coefficients may seem low at first sight, but keep in mind that they are affected by the noise in the data, and that this should be taken into account when assessing the explanatory power of the model. If you'd like to read more about this, I suggest checking out these papers. These results show that AlexNet can predict object representations in brain and behavior. This is very exciting because earlier computational models of visual processing were unable to reach this level of performance. While this is exciting, we should also ask what these results teach us about brain function. The fact that a neural network can predict the brain's responses to images does not necessarily mean that the underlying computations are shared between the network and the brain. However, neural networks do provide an explicit computational account of how the visual system may transform sensory signals into meaningful representations. They force the researcher to make decisions about network architecture, learning rules, and learning objectives. In other words, they force the researcher to think deeply about how the brain is organized, how it learns, and what it learns. We can build multiple competing models inspired by existing empirical data about brain function and compare the explanatory power of these models at predicting human behavior and brain data. Models that explain the data well provide plausible computational accounts of brain information processing. Neural networks thus allow us to test competing hypotheses about brain computation and function. As we will see in the next few slides, current models leave significant portions of the variance in both behavior and brain data unexplained, which means that there is room for model improvement. So it becomes quite clear that deep nets are still different from humans when we more closely compare object categorization behavior between humans and deep nets. I'm going to show you a few images now. Try to generate a category label for each of them when they come up. This was probably relatively easy, except maybe for the last image. Here are the category labels that human observers provided for these images. And here are the category labels that deep nets provided. In most cases, this is AlexNet. And question marks just indicate that the network tends to make an error. As you can see, deep nets struggle with these images. Let's look at them more closely. The first image is an adversarial example. It has been altered by introducing imperceptibly small changes in pixel intensities informed by knowledge of the network's error gradients, with the aim of changing the network's how the network classifies the image. This is a little unfair to the network because we intentionally deceived it, which we can't do for humans because we lack full knowledge of the brain's error gradients. However, the next image clearly shows that standard deep nets are less robust to uniform additive white noise than humans. Humans classify this image as a bicycle with 50% accuracy in a 16 alternative forced choice categorization task. For AlexNet to reach the same performance, the noise needs to be reduced to this level. The third image exposes a strong bias towards texture information. This bias is observed across a range of standard deep nets, including AlexNet, V2G, and ResNet, and can be reduced by forcing the networks to rely on shape rather than texture information during categorization training. The fourth image is a so-called challenge image. Deep nets make significantly more errors in categorizing this image than humans do, who interestingly do take longer than average to categorize this image. For comparison, here is an easier image, for which deep nets and humans show similar performance. Finally, humans are better at recognizing partially occluded objects than deep nets. For this level of occlusion, human performance is at 80% accuracy in a 5 alternative forced choice categorization task, while AlexNet performance is below 60%. If you'd like to know more about these findings, please check out the following papers. So these findings back the following question: how can we make deep nets more human? This is an important question for those of us who use deep nets as models of the brain. The idea here is that the better our models, the better we may understand the brain. I would like to highlight 3 key aspects of deep net design and training that can serve as guidelines for improving deep nets as models of the brain. The first is objective functions, or loss functions, which express the learning goal of the system. In other words, what are we supposed to learn? So far, the learning goal has been to categorize objects in images. While humans share this learning goal with deep nets, the human visual system likely tries to achieve other goals as well. Here you can think, for example, of predicting object movements or preparing to grasp an object. Some of these learning goals may be achieved through self-supervised learning. The second key aspect is learning rules, which specify how we learn. In other words, they specify how we update the weights during training. Backpropagation is efficient, but may not be biologically plausible. Recent work has therefore proposed alternative mechanisms which can locally approximate error signals. A third key aspect is network architecture. The architecture specifies the structure of the modeled system and thus determines how information can flow through the network. I will elaborate on this in the next few slides. Here are a few references to great reviews and perspectives on this particular topic. So let's focus on network architecture now. One important issue is that classical deep convolutional neural networks, which are the standard in the field, lack recurrent connections. The image here shows a schematic of a classical, purely feed-forward deep network. Information can only flow in one direction, from input, the image, to output, the category label. In the brain, however, there's an abundance of recurrent connections, here indicated in red, which allow back and forth message passing between neurons. This schematic shows lateral connections, which allow message passing within a brain region, and top-down connections, which can carry feedback signals from higher to lower level regions. Multiple studies have shown that recurrent processing is crucial for visual cognition, especially for recognizing objects under challenging visual conditions, such as occlusion. So, consistent with the proposed role of recurrent processing in object recognition, adding recurrent connections to a feed-forward neural network improves object recognition performance. This is an image from Tang and colleagues who compared AlexNet with human observers on a 5 alternative forced choice categorization task performed on partially occluded objects such as this one. The x-axis here shows the percentage of the object that is visible. The y-axis shows performance at the task. This is chance performance. I'm going to show performance for human observers in black and for 2 versions of AlexNet. The first version is standard AlexNet, with standard feed-forward weights, here shown in red. The second version additionally has lateral connections in fully connected layer 7, indicated in blue. Results show that human observers outperform AlexNet at recognizing partially occluded objects. However, AlexNet performance increases significantly by adding lateral connections, which enables the network to perform pattern completion. Other studies showed similar results for a range of stimuli, and these studies also showed, and that is important, that adding recurrent connections improves model performance at explaining brain data as well. So with this, we've now come to the last slide of the outro. We've discussed network architectures. I didn't have time to go into recent work on objective functions and learning rules, but I would be happy to do so in the question and answer session later this week. I hope this lecture has provided a useful overview of how to relate neural networks to brain data and behavior, as well as good starting points for how to improve neural networks as models of the brain. Thanks for listening.